So glad you could join us today to have a very important conversation about things that people in society are asking all the time. What do we do with Israel? How do we handle the criticism against Israel? Can we trust who Israel is today? What does the Bible say? What should our position be? And I'm so honored to host a conversation with Scott Volk and with Lee Cummings. So we're going to jump into it today. So Scott, Lee, common question. Has the church replaced Israel?
I love that question because it's a question that's being asked by so many around the world. And I think what we would, from a theological term, maybe that would be called replacement theology, supersessionism, where people say the church has superseded Israel, that the promises that God made to Israel are now no longer applicable to Israel, but have been transferred to the church. I don't know if this is something that you're hearing a lot about, but it's huge in the world today.
And I think primarily that's the frame of reference that's being taught in modern seminaries and Bible colleges to young leaders. And so it's becoming more and more of an issue practically in the American church, where I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, this wasn't as much of a deal, where it's being taught. It's an allegorical system of interpretation. Like you said, we've spiritualized the Old Testament promises that God has made to the physical descendants of Abraham, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, and we've spiritually applied them to the church. And it boils down to, it's an error in our hermeneutic. It's an error in our understanding that God actually hasn't replaced Israel with the church, but he's actually grafted the church into the covenant promises that were originally given to Israel. But that doesn't mean that God does not have a future plan, as Paul writes in Romans, to graft them back in. And my question is if God has replaced Israel with the church, then why is he grafting them back in if they're already replaced?
That's so good.
So the fact that Paul makes a distinction between Israel after the flesh and the church that has been grafted in as the wild olive branches, to me, it invalidates any argument that he has somehow removed any promises or unconditional covenant promises to the physical descendants of Israel.
Yeah, it feels actually not slightly arrogant, but very arrogant.
Which is exactly what Paul says.
Which is exactly what Paul says. It's like, okay, you were the chosen, now we are the chosen. And it's interesting, Lee, because in Romans, it says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. Partial blindness has happened where Israel is concerned, lest you become wise in your own conceit.
Correct.
So I think that the repercussions of people who are ignorant where the mystery of Israel is concerned, the natural outlay or the natural, what follows naturally is going to become conceit. It's all about me. It's all about me. You know, it's just so interesting. You're a guest at my house, and I'm so glad you're here.
Which is wonderful, by the way.
I'm so glad you're here. But if I take off and say, Lee, just take care of the house for me, and then I come back a week later and you say, no, this is my house, that would be the height of arrogance. And it seems, I know this is a very simple allegory, but it seems like that's exactly what happened, that the Jewish people, Jesus came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He came as their Messiah. Salvation comes through the Jewish people, but now this group of people that have become part and grafted in, according to the word, are saying, it's all about me. So I would just really say this, that for those of us who have been really brought into the family of God, we've got to remember where our origins are. We've got to remember that Jesus, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And in the same way that Jesus came through the lineage of Abraham, he's coming back as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And he's coming back because it says in the word that all Israel shall be saved. If the church has replaced Israel, what keeps God from replacing us as the church? Because let me just tell you something.
That's absolutely
the church rejected Israel. I'm not so sure the church is in that great of a place today. And if this is about God replacing somebody because of their inability to be perfect,
Yeah.
then he certainly has a right to replace us.
You know, what's the most famous New Testament scripture that almost everybody knows? What is it? John 3:16.
For God
so
loved
loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have what?
Everlasting.
Everlasting life. That word everlasting is where we get our confidence, right? If you go back to God's promises to Abraham in Genesis, I believe it's Genesis 17, he says, I'm making this as an everlasting covenant.
Right.
And so here's what I say, is if you believe that God can cut Israel off after he's promised to, on a unilateral level, to make an everlasting covenant, which means forever, if God's willing to violate that everlasting, then you ought to be concerned that God can violate your everlasting.
That's so good.
Because it's interesting to me also that in a lot of ways, supersessionism or replacement theology finds its origin really in medieval church history, but expounded the most in the Reformed circles, which, if you know Reform, one of the tulip, the 5 points of tulip is unconditional election. That God has elected the saints without them doing anything, and then it follows with preservation of the saints or perseverance of the saints. In other words, eternal security. It's interesting that in the church, the very people who espouse God cutting off the Old Testament covenant people have a theological premise for themselves that no matter what they do, they can't lose their salvation. So they refuse replacement theology in their own salvation experience, but they think God has done that to the Jewish people. It's inconsistent.
It is inconsistent. Listen, if God can make a covenant with Abraham and with the children of Israel, it has nothing to do with Israel's faithfulness to the covenant that ratifies that covenant, but everything to do with God's faithfulness to Israel. It's interesting because when God made that covenant with Abraham, he actually, in the Old Testament, in those times, to make a covenant really means to cut.
To cut.
Right? So they would cut the animals and put them on both sides of the road, kind of make a path. And we would walk through together if we were making a covenant, and we would say, listen, if we should break this covenant, may what happened to those animals happen to us, right? So God does the same thing with Abraham. He says, okay, take the turtle dove and whatever animals he said, cut them in half. And then he puts Abraham to sleep, and God walks through those pieces, showing us that because he knew if Abraham walked through, Abraham would fail.
Yeah, and the fact that he put Abraham asleep is actually a type of the fact that God would be eternally faithful to Israel, even during Israel's hardening or their partial sleep.
Yeah.
That he would remain faithful to that.
Good.
And that when they awake, God's faithfulness would still be there.
Guys, this is incredible stuff. It's important. Thank you for taking the time to talk about very weighty things in a way that I really believe honors God. And thank all of you for watching today. If you want to know more about these issues, learn more about God's heart for Israel, you can check out Scott's ministry, Together for Israel, togetherforisrael.org, or you can go to Pastor Lee Cummings' church, Radient.Church. Find his new book, Why Israel Matters, and we would love to hear from you what you think about these things.